Welcome to Coach2Scale, how modern leaders build coaching cultures. I'm your host, Matt Benelli. Join me as we build a community of like-minded professionals who share the belief that effective coaching improves the performance of every team member. Our mission is to help leaders become better coaches. The Coach2Scale podcast is sponsored by Coachum, the world's first AI coaching execution platform that leverages evidence-based coaching to increase quota attainment. And with that, let's get started. All right, everybody, you're in for a real treat today. I'm excited to sit down with our guest. She's an expert at helping startups solve their management and culture challenges. She's an entrepreneur. She's a board advisor. She's an educator. She's an author. And she comes with a great perspective. Bachelor's degree from Georgetown, MBA and PhD from the Wharton School. Currently, she's a professor at the Georgetown McDonough School of Business, and she's also an author of the best-selling book, Bringing Up the Boss. Rachel Pacheco, welcome to Coach2Scale.
Thank you, Matt. I'm so excited to be here with you.
Excited to have you. And I forgot to mention a yogi, a practitioner of yoga, which is how we came into meeting each other. So, Rachel, really excited to sit down and have this conversation with you because you wear a lot of different hats as an educator, as an advisor, someone who sits on boards and works with companies solving all different types of management challenges. And that's what we're talking about today. But as I'm sure you've seen along your journey, Rachel, there's a lot of myths that pop up in this crazy world and in this business. What's a myth about coaching that you believe is misleading or maybe even complete BS?
Yeah. So it's such a great question. And, I'm sure, and I know you've heard on this podcast before that, there's a big myth around motivation, right? That we think employees, especially salespeople, that they're just motivated by chasing money. So that's a common myth. But I want to actually extend that myth to the myth that employees don't need to find meaning in what they do in the day-to-day. And even more so, that managers and leaders have no part in helping them find meaning. So we have this myth that meaning, especially for folks in the sales realm, is not a critical component of the job, and that leaders and managers have no part in helping their teams find meaning. It's actually the exact opposite. Meaning is front and center from what we see in research and surveys and what employees want and crave in their day-to-day. And managers and leaders have a critical responsibility and role in helping their team members find that meaning and purpose day-to-day.
So you're equating meaning and purpose, right? So we can use those two interchangeably for the most part?
Yeah. And it's a great question, because what we often think about in terms of meaning and purpose is what I like to call kind of big M meaning, or big P purpose, right? Like, what am I doing with my life? What's my life purpose? But what we actually see is that meaning and purpose is a day-to-day set of actions and behaviors. It's the day-to-day purpose you find, or the day-to-day meaning you find in your day, that really matters. And I think what happens a lot is that, managers and leaders are incredibly busy and incredibly time constrained, and the thought of coaching someone on finding their life meaning, right? It's like, go to a yoga retreat for that. Speaking of yoga. But it's actually this day-to-day meaning in what we do with our colleagues at work. It's that meaning. It's really, really important. And again, needs to be central in how people think about and do their work.
So there's perhaps some managers out there who are like, well, what do you mean? My job is to make sure my people are doing their job. They come in, they have a number to hit in the sales rep, they have a number to hit. And, I just need to make sure they do it. And what I hear you saying is, uh, yeah, but how do you help them find meaning in their work? Why is the juice worth the squeeze for that manager to go make the extra effort to do that in a time crunched world?
Yeah. So, what research shows us is that folks who have more meaning in their day to day work are more fulfilled, more satisfied, and more engaged. Right.
Mhm.
But to your question of, well, what about the juice? We also see that employees are more productive when they have that meaning. So there's this great research from Adam Grant, who I'm sure many of your listeners
Yeah,
know
yeah,
about, where he actually looked at call centers, right? And you can think of call centers as the you know outcome generating, right? Like I'm being paid for the calls that I make and the money that I bring in. And what he showed was that when he was able to bring more meaning into the call center, and he did that by bringing in folks who benefited from the output of the call
yeah.
center, he found that employees were more satisfied and more engaged, and they were more productive at making those outbound calls to solicit donations. So it's both satisfaction and engagement and happier workers, and it's productivity, which I think is such an important piece to remember when we're trying to rationalize, why might I be spending extra time on helping my team members find meaning?
Fair to say they're more productive and effective during the day, and they stay longer in their role. And both of those are good for companies. I mean, I think that's kind of a rhetorical question. Um, so one of the challenges that a lot of managers and leaders share with me is, or one of the questions they ask is, how do I motivate this person? And you know, there's an axiom that I've heard time and time again that you know, uh, prospects buy for their reasons on their timelines all the time. And if you extend that, salespeople come to work for their reasons, not their managers, right? Employees come to work for their reasons, not their bosses' reasons. Um, this is that do we get to the point of like extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation here, right? Extrinsic, like wave the carrot and the gift certificate and the Starbucks card or the trip, the money. But what you're talking about, purpose, doesn't that tie back into more intrinsic motivation? Like they kind of motivate themselves?
It's such a good question. It's actually both, right? And I think um the really important thing you highlighted in your description was that managers might have a different set of motivators than their employees. And those different motivators might be intrinsic and they might be
Okay.
extrinsic. And so, actually, the really important thing to remember with motivation is that each of your team members is motivated by something different. And then, as managers and leaders, we need to understand and figure out what uniquely drives our team members, and then structure incentives if possible to align with that, but also structure things like praise or the type of work we give them, or the recognition we give them to align with that motivation style. So let me provide a quick example.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So some folks are super motivated by a sense of belonging, right? These are folks that are called affiliators, right? And motivated by affiliation. And what drives me is working as part of a high functioning team, collaborating with people and having really deep relationships. Really motivating. It's why, someone might come to work in the morning. Their manager might be motivated by an archetype called achievement, which is motivation by hitting goals, tackling really complex problems, being challenged and being able to overcome those challenges.
Mhm, mhm.
And so, achievement oriented people Doesn't mean they don't like working with colleagues or don't like working as part of a team, but they could be just as content as an individual contributor working on a hard problem as they could be working on a hard problem with a team. That's what motivates them is the problem and the challenge and achieving the goal, right? And so what we often see is we have a manager who's an achiever who says, "Oh, I'm going to give Matt, because he's done so well and I want to reward him, I'm going to give him this new, exciting, challenging project that he's just going to be so thrilled to sink his teeth into and work on. And that's going to be such a reward for him." But Matt, if you're an affiliator, you think, why is my manager giving me more work and then expecting me to be excited about this?
Right.
Right. And so we often have this disconnect between what managers are motivated by and what their team members are motivated by. And so it's really important to understand, again, intrinsically and extrinsically what motivates someone, to then tailor your approach as a manager. So the spot bonus for someone might mean nothing to someone else. And we often fall into that trap of motivating everyone on our team exactly the same way.
Well, motivation is part of coaching, and all too often we're peanut buttering out the coaching everybody the same way. And what you're saying is, you can't motivate everyone the same way either, right? I I think I might have shared this story. I remember years ago, a good friend saying that he was a sales engineer, a pre-sales consultant. So he was like the smart person who understood how the technology worked, and he was part of the sales team, and he would help advance the opportunities along. And he's like, "Hey, our team had a great quarter, and so the reward for that is this dinner at this really nice steakhouse in New York City." And I said, "Well, that sounds cool, like nice night out with your peers." And he kind of said, I knew this. He's a very introverted person. And he's like, I don't want to hang out with my colleagues at work. I like them, but at the end of the day, when I go home, I just want to be with my family. And he's like, by the way, I live in whatever, like Stamford, Connecticut. So now I have to like take the train home instead of at whatever 5:30, 6 o'clock at like midnight after dinner. And oh, by the way, I got to get up and take the train back in at 6 o'clock in the morning again. This was back in the day where people commuted. And he's like, that's not a reward for me. This is a penalty, And I just remember that. So whether you're an affiliator or an achiever, you're motivated in different ways. Um, what's I guess, can everybody be motivated? Like that's a question that just went through my mind. Can everyone be motivated?
That's a good question. I don't know the scientific or research backed answer to that. For most folks or for all folks that I've worked with, it's about cracking the nut of what is motivating,
Yeah.
right? Like figuring it in for some folks, it's harder than others to figure that out. But my assumption or my hypothesis is that yes, we all are motivated by something. It's just figuring out what. And I think what you brought up that was so important is coaching plays such a huge part in this, because you're asking those open-ended questions and you're learning from your team member what's important to them, what makes them happiest, right? Why do they come to work in the morning? And asking those questions can help to ascertain what's going to be motivating to them. So
Mm.
it's coaching is such an important way to get at, what is that nugget that's going to make someone super excited about what they're doing and want to come to work each day.
And as a reminder, and I'm just grabbing your book here, so we'll put the link in. But it's Bringing Up the Boss. And Rachel, in your book, you define coaching as a technique used to guide one toward greater self-awareness, clarity on decisions, and choices, and reflection on past behaviors. Right. So just a framework, like on what is coaching. And we've been talking about like how to use coaching to motivate and make work more meaningful. In the book, you talk about how in terms of helping it be more meaningful, how it's structured and how it's framed. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. And so this goes back to that myth, right? That the responsibility or one of the most critical actions of a manager is to help someone find meaning. And so then the natural question is, okay, well, how do I do that, right? Tactically,
Right.
what's the to do when I get to work tomorrow to actually do that? And what we see is that there are a number of levers that managers can pull to help someone find more meaning. And I'll just kind of list out a couple. The first, to your point, is around structure. Like how we structure someone's day-to-day work or day-to-day tasks has a direct influence on how much meaning they find in that task. So you could have someone who has two people who have the same exact set of responsibilities, but because manager A structures those responsibilities in one way and manager B structures them in another way, it could have vastly different impact on meaning. One example of structure is how much autonomy you're able to give someone over their day. And so we think about micromanagers, right, who give
Yeah.
people no autonomy. And what we see is when we're super in the weeds with someone and we're dictating every single step of what they do, that decreases meaning in their work, right? They don't have the joy of discovering how to do something themselves. And so if we can identify outcomes, identify a vision, and then let someone figure out how to get there, that's super meaningful for people. And so that's an example of structure, right? How you structure someone's task. I like to use the example, we say, hey, we need to get to the top of this mountain. And then the person says, okay, I'm going to take a helicopter to get there. And someone else says, I'm going to take a donkey. Doesn't matter. We just want to get to the top.
And I've heard the phrase, strategy is non-negotiable, but style is, right? You need to get to the top of the mountain. How you do it doesn't always matter. And maybe the best style is your own unique style, and people are going to do it in different ways. The micromanager says you must do it and you must do it this way. And they're watching every step up the mountain to see if you took that step the right way. A lot of managers are so fearful, right? That's their biggest fear. I don't want to be that micromanager, like the dreaded micromanager, but almost they over index toward not managing at all and not setting clear expectations. What's the importance of setting clear expectations?
Yeah, it's and this is the first chapter in my book because it's so important. And this is also where coaching comes in, right? Is a clear expectation is what's the end goal and why, right? It's why are we doing this? And it's, hey, here's an example of what good or success looks like in timing, right? So we're really clear about that. And so for some folks, they say, okay, I can run with this. Um, and there is a fear from managers of, wait a minute, if I let go, what's this end goal or vision going to look like? But this is where coaching comes in, right? Is you're then throughout the process, throughout them climbing the mountain, you can ask, okay, what would be an alternative way to do this? What does success look like in your mind in terms of achieving this outcome? Or what could you do differently in the next, in the next series of steps? And so you're getting people they still have the autonomy, but you're helping them get the rigor, right? In thinking through each of the steps that they're taking. And you can help course correct if you don't think it's going well. And I think that's a really important distinction from I'm just going to tell you every step of the way.
And I think you called them in the book beautiful questions. You referred to them as that, right? Which, the Socratic method, the asking questions like, "Hey, what's another way to approach this?" And I'm assuming the opposite and less effective way to do it is, "Here's what you should do, and here's how you should do it." Um, can you talk a little bit about beautiful questions and then also feedback along the way? Look, I guess kind of beautiful questions and segue to once they start doing it, how do you provide feedback and what's the importance of feedback?
So I was actually going to flip that. I'm going to talk about
Okay.
first because If we go back to finding meaning, we talked about structure, how managers in their day-to-day can provide a different way of structuring work to get more meaning. And so this idea of autonomy, right? Setting expectations, but letting people figure out is a huge way of creating meaning. The other way of doing it is having feedback loops such that individuals know how their work is being used and the impact that it has. And what we see with feedback, besides feedback being a really important motivator, a really important way to get people to change or reinforce behaviors, it also has a huge role in helping people find more meaning, right? Which is often not talked about with feedback.
Didn't you equate it to, it's like underwear?
Yeah, I also said that's a whole different conversation, that feedback is like underwear. It's a gift we often want, but we need, but don't actually want. But feedback, if we think about positive feedback for a moment, in the connection to meaning with positive feedback, Matt, you send me a sales plan, right? With all of your targets and your approach for the next 6 months. And I'm your manager and I get it. And I say, wow, Matt, what an awesome job. You really rocked the sales plan. Well done. Right. And I pat myself on the back as a manager, because I say, wow, I didn't ignore Matt's email and I was really, offered lots of praise and positive reinforcement for what he did. That doesn't provide more meaning for an individual though, right? Instead, if I said something like, Matt, your sales plan clearly identified targets per region. And I loved how specific you were about the different steps and strategies you're going to take to reach out to them. And the impact on kind of this diligence and this attention to detail, the impact that it had was that it allowed me to go to senior leadership with much more confidence to say, this is how we're going to reach our sales targets. Moving forward, you can actually bring the same approach of specificity and attention to detail in, the marketing plan that we build. And I think you'd really, thrive in doing that there. And that email, that response creates much more meaning for you, right? Because you understand how your work and how your time impacted, not just your day-to-day work, but mine as your manager and the company leadership. And you find more meaning in that. And it's a really easy way for managers and leaders to help their teams find more meaning and motivate people more to do great work when we have that specificity in giving feedback.
So if they send you something, you're acknowledging it, right? I think, you talked about the importance of acknowledging when somebody does some work. Don't just assume that they know you're grateful. But then it's also, instead of saying, hey, great job, and then connect the dots to how this helps the team, how this helps the company, something like that, so that they can see, like, yeah, first of all, you're making that connection, right? Of like what they're doing and where it impacts. But you're also building trust and confidence in that person, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Folks know exactly why their work was good, as opposed to just these platitudes, right?
Right.
And then if you're just getting platitudes and you think, well, what about it was actually positive, and then what's left unsaid, or what were there negative things about it, right? That they're not telling me because it's just masked in platitudes. And so it's really kind of the specificity. What made this good? What made this a great piece of work? And it's the connection to the broader team, to the impact it had, to the kind of connection to the company mission or company goals. Those things create a ton of meaning for people.
Oh, okay. Got it. Super helpful too. And so you talked about the positive feedback. And one of the challenges is, as managers, we want to, like, we want to give positive feedback, and we're not always as specific as we need to be. But then also there's constructive feedback, negative feedback, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. Can you touch on that? Because I think many would say that's a tough thing to do.
Yeah. And it's funny, I call constructive feedback as underwear, right? As a gift you probably need, but likely don't want. But it's actually false. So what we see in research is that employees crave constructive feedback and don't feel like their managers give them enough of it. And on the flip side, managers are incredibly hesitant and often don't give constructive feedback. So you actually have this really powerful disconnect where managers, from really legitimate fears of hurting someone's feelings or having an awkward conversation, or feeling like they're stepping out of bounds, there's this disconnect where they're not giving the feedback, yet their employees really, really want it and crave it. And so if we can if we can rebalance, it would be really powerful. Um,
Is that where beautiful questions come in?
um, say more what you mean by that, or what you're thinking. Why it would.
Yeah, and it might not. Well, if I remember correctly, well, questions in general and the beautiful questions help the manager connect more with his or her employee. So, like for example, the way I'm processing this in my simple mind is, oh, hey, here's what you did that's really good with the specificity that you talked about. On this topic over here, with regard to your go-to-market plan, um, I like what you did here and here. If there was one thing that might be missing, or one area where you struggled on this, what would it be? Right. And so it's asking questions to kind of segue over to that constructive feedback, and it's not, hey, this sucks. It's more of a Socratic method. That's where I was going with it.
Yeah, so that's such an interesting point. So when I think what's hard is because we fear giving feedback, we have a hard time being precise and concise, even if we know what someone needs to do to improve. And so often what I see with managers is they fall into kind of the Socratic method trap where they ask their team members, "Hey, what do you think is wrong with this?" Or "Where do you think you could have done things better?"
Looks perfect to me.
Right. When in reality, the manager from experience and from time actually knows exactly the behavior that needs to be changed. And what often happens is folks feel a little bit duped because again, their manager isn't being straightforward and direct about, "Hey, Matt, I observed that your work plan was a couple of days late. The impact that it had is that I wasn't able to, to give it to the client on time, which actually made the client kind of question our attention to detail and kind of question our commitment to the project. Do you have any reactions to this, or what do you think?" "Oh my God," Matt says, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea that this was on the work plan was due. I just assumed end of week meant Sunday versus Friday." And then we talk about how we can address this behavior moving forward. Um, a conversation like that's really straightforward and starts from an objective piece of data. "Hey, the work plan was late, period." That's the data. As opposed to, "Hey, Matt, what do you think you could have done better on the work plan?" Which might be
Yeah.
misleading. Or even worse is, "Hey, Matt, I'd love to give you some constructive feedback about how you're tardy with your work," right? Which is making a judgment call about you,
Yeah.
as opposed to just starting from an observable behavior, an observable action, where we then can build the conversation from there.
Right. It's not personal. You're not calling me lazy, or inconsiderate. You're just stating a fact. And then perhaps that, now that you have that on the table, then perhaps questions and dialogue can ensue about, going, where appropriate.
Exactly. And you might come back to me and say, Rachel, I actually have an email that says that the work plan was due on Sunday. So, it wasn't due on Friday. And then we have a conversation about, okay, how can we make our communication style better? So we're not having these missteps, right? And it's a feedback conversation, right? The goal is to understand our own behaviors and other people's behaviors better. And it's not I'm trying to prove to you that I'm right and what you did was wrong. It's not a litigation. It's this conversation of, hey, I want to understand your behavior better and help you to change that behavior if it's not serving you well and not serving our team well, or reinforce positive behavior.
So is feedback, it's super helpful, and we've established that. Employees want it. Managers are sometimes reluctant to give it, especially constructive feedback. Is it a nice to have, or is it an obligation as a manager to provide feedback to your employees?
It's I wish there were a stronger word than obligation, because it's that important for someone's development. And what we actually see there's two things. So I remember when I was really early in my consulting career, I had a manager who at the time, right, I was 21, 22. I started my first kind of adult job, and he was giving me feedback constantly, constructive feedback constantly. And he was a year older than me, right? And I had friends my own age in my workplace, and their managers weren't giving them that same feedback. And I was like, oh man, I got the short end of the stick, right, with this guy who was just constantly on my back. And then in hindsight, I think about how his interventions early in my career changed my trajectory versus him not saying anything and just letting these kind of little behaviors at the time, right? They weren't big behaviors, but they weren't serving me well in my development. He could have just not said anything, and I would have just continued doing these for the,
Yeah.
10, 15 years in my career. But he had the courage, and took his role really responsible, really seriously, in giving me the constructive feedback so that I could change those behaviors, and it changed my career trajectory. And so, it's like such an important responsibility of managers
Do you remember an example?
to develop.
I'm sorry. Do you remember an example? Like, do you remember an example of like that type of, feedback that was like the underwear? You didn't want to hear it at the time, but
I was like such a naive, new employee. Like I remember, like it would just drive me bananas when I would send him a slide deck and he would say, Rachel, like you need to use the template. Like each slide can't have a different color blue, right? I'd be like, oh, I'm being so creative. And I'm like, why? Like, and he'd be like, because when we have different colors of blue, or, when your boxes aren't left aligned in your deck, the client calls into question our attention to detail. And then when they call that into question, that huge financial model that you're building, they call all of your assumptions into question. And so that's why it's important to, follow the template and left align your boxes on a PowerPoint deck. It's not just aesthetic, right? It matters. I was like, oh, now I get it, right?
Well, and that ties back to your definition on coaching, which is guiding toward greater self-awareness. Hey, I wasn't aware of that. And clarity on decisions and choices. Like, hey, I'm creative. Different color slides, and reflection on past behaviors. Like it connects the dots. Like maybe the world isn't always the way I see it. Perhaps there's another way of looking at this thing that I had no idea. Like I wasn't ignoring it. I just didn't know.
I had no idea. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I think if there's one thing that listeners can do is just start giving your team members more feedback because they crave it. And if you don't, you might be inadvertently holding people back in their careers, which folks don't want to do, right? We want to help people develop.
That's right.
And it's a real miss if we just let people, because we're afraid of being mean, right? If we let people continue with behaviors that aren't serving them well.
Which is maybe a really good segue into why you wrote Bringing Up the Boss in the first place. Like, what compelled you to do that? Not an easy challenge.
So, about 8 years ago, I joined a quickly growing healthcare startup as the chief people officer. And, upon stepping into the role, what I pretty much immediately realized was that the managers in our company were really poorly equipped to manage. And part of it was, part of it was startup specific, where you get folks who, because they were early employees, 2 years later, they're managing a team of 20, not because they're capable or competent managing, just because they've been there the longest, right? And these are
And,
people who were 2 years out of college, right? And then all of a sudden they have a team of 20. And and what I realized was that the managers were miserable and the team members were miserable, because the managers wanted to do a good job and wanted to help their teams, but had no idea how to do it. So long
misery loves company. That's the good news.
Totally right. So long story short is, I kind of went on a quest to find a management, like a management toolkit or a management workbook that just gave people basic tools to start implementing immediately into their day to day. And when I went out looking for something, and we were resource constrained and time constrained, right? Didn't have a lot of either. Couldn't send people off to training, couldn't bring, expensive trainers in, couldn't find that resource. So what I started doing was every week I would send a tip that was based in kind of academic research and data, because especially in the people space, there's a lot of stuff that folks suggest doing that's not grounded in research, right? And so I would send a tip and, okay, now practice it this week. And I sent it to the whole company. And I started to realize that people were forwarding those emails outside the company. And so I started writing a blog for everyone. And then that blog became Bringing Up the Boss, which is really focused on practical tools and tips for managers to bring into their day-to-day. That's going to help build that muscle of management, right? It's a skill. It's a capability that you need to build.
Right.
And so that was the birth of Bringing Up the Boss.
Which is really cool, because you didn't sit down and say, I want to be an author and I want to write a book and I want my name in lights. You were already doing it and you recognized it was helping people. And it was just a way to, package up all those blog posts and emails over the past, years or whatever, and provide that nice package. That's really cool. My guess is, over the similar period of time, you learned some hard lessons along the way. Care to share any?
Yeah, and in the book, I talk about this thing that I have this like never again journal, and these are kind of mistakes that anyone who's in the position of management, you've probably made it once, and you say to yourself, "I will never again do this again." Right?
Rachel, never again. And if I can show it, if specifically, if you are in charge of hiring people and developing them and retaining them, you want to read this book, because this whole thing about the never again journal, it's going to rub some tinfoil on a lot of cavities out there, Rachel. But I cut you off. What's the never again? What's the never again journal?
Yeah, and I think, you hit on one where the hiring, I think there's a lot of never agains in hiring, because the pain and the anguish and the heartache, of dealing with someone that you didn't hire well is just enough to, scare anyone into making a great hiring process. And so, things like hiring people based solely on cultural fit, right? Not vetting people well. Like, those are mistakes that, like, never again will I do that. Like, I will always have a structured interview process that truly tests what we actually need in a role,
Mhm.
as opposed to loose conversations to determine if we like the person, right? Because that's recipe for disaster. So that's probably top on my list.
Right. From a research perspective, I think the research supports that people don't have a structured interview process and they hire based on how they feel about that person. Do they like that person, which is a kind of a gut reaction. And especially in the line of field, in the line of work that I've spent most of my career in, which is sales. Uh, any good salesperson, any even decent salesperson, should be able to connect with someone and make themselves likable in an interview. So there's a saying that's hire slow, fire fast. There's a reason for that.
Totally. Yeah. And I think we're also we tend to hire people who are like us because we
Mhm.
think that we're, successful at our role. And so we're really biased towards people who remind us of ourselves. And that just,
Yeah,
creates
yeah.
a recipe for disaster.
So you're at Georgetown, phenomenal school. What do you love about teaching at Georgetown in the business school?
Oh, there's too many things to list. I absolutely love my job. I feel so fortunate and lucky that I've landed in a place where, I find meaning every day. And that was something that I had been missing in earlier parts of my career, was this idea of like, how do I have meaning in what I do? And I finally feel like I found that as a professor and as, being able to connect with practitioners, which I still do very much so.
Hmm.
A really important part of my role that I'm not just in the ivory tower,
Right.
on what's going on in the world. But by far, the ability to deeply connect with students, makes the job why I think it's the best job in the world. And what I found is that students, like so many of us, are looking for a deep sense of belonging, right? In the classroom, I have a huge opportunity to create that sense of belonging and allow students to explore themselves better and explore their relationships with other people better, and feel a sense of belonging and to see people change over the course of the semester and get to know themselves better and create a culture and a community in class. It's just incredibly powerful for me.
You know, a word that I found myself underlining a lot when I was reading your book was the word curious, or curiosity. And in fact, it inspired me to. I'm listening to a book right now called A Curious Mind. It was written by I don't know if it's Brian Glazer or Brian Grazer. He's a Hollywood producer, and I found the books like super fascinating. And this whole topic of curiosity is curiosity important, and if so, like how does it apply to what you're doing, and you know what you see in your students?
Such a good question. And I think it goes back to the beautiful questions, right?
Yeah.
And the power of those beautiful questions in that, as managers, as leaders, as a professor, um, letting curiosity guide you, right? Like understanding why someone behaves the way they do, or what's driving them or what's motivating them is just, first of all, helpful in terms of having a productive relationship with someone and super interesting, right? You learn more
Yeah.
about yourself, you learn more about them. Um, and like going back to feedback, the idea of curiosity and feedback, if you enter a feedback conversation with true curiosity,
Oh, yeah.
I wanna I wanna learn why someone might have done something the way they did and truly be curious about what we can do to make it better. That's gonna be a totally different conversation from one where I think, "Okay, I'm here to tell the person what they did wrong," right? And so, I think curiosity, just keeping the lens of curiosity and ambient conversations with students is just an incredible approach and way of being.
Well, I would imagine, there's the saying, people don't care what you know until they know that you care, right? You're the professor, you have all this experience, right? They look up to you because of your title and because of your track record, but they probably go the extra mile for you and for themselves when they know that you're curious about them and about the topic that you're talking about, and you're not just going through the motions to get through the syllabus and get through the day. Would that be fair?
Totally. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
So a couple of rapid fire questions as we approach closing out here. Um, what's a common challenge on which people, other companies, other individuals come and seek your advice?
Yeah, so I think, and the big one, and probably because of the book I've written, is I get a lot of just management challenges, right? Like how do I better equip my managers? And so it's a frequent question. CEOs often struggle with it, right? Like how do I get my people to be better managers? And I think one of the things I counsel folks on is management is a whole bunch of different things. Like what capabilities do you specifically need to build in your team?
Mm.
Are your managers not good at motivating? Are they not good at having difficult conversations? Are they, what's the thing? But I usually get a lot of challenges around just, hey, my people aren't good managers. What do I do?
Well, a lot of times they got the battlefield promotion. It's like, congratulations, you were good as an individual contributor. Now you're a manager. Thoughts and prayers. Good luck. I totally get it. And Rachel, you've touched on this question a little bit. I don't know if you can expand on it, but tell us about a time in your career when you were the recipient of really good coaching, even though you might not have thought it was great coaching at the time.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I had an executive coach. I was on the executive team of a new startup that was at at JP Morgan Chase. And, I was struggling with my CEO at the time around the CEO kind of not taking the feedback that I was giving her, not changing, right, based on this feedback that I was giving her. And the coach at the time said this really insightful thing where he was like, first, it's effective feedback, right? Like it's not all feedback. So sometimes I think when we think about feedback, and I just had this conversation with a CEO last week where he was like, it's my obligation to tell my team members everything that they did wrong. And performance reviews are coming up, and I have this list of everything that didn't do well over the course of the year because I care about feedback. And it's like, yeah, but feedback's a motivator ultimately. And so you have to also be strategic about feedback. What feedback do you want to give? What's the behavior you want to change? A laundry list of things someone did wrong because you feel strongly that you give feedback, that's not effective, right?
Yeah.
And so that was the first thing the coach talked about was, what's strategic and effective about your feedback? It's not just telling her all the areas that you think she can, do better.
Yeah.
And then the second was, hey, especially when you're working with the CEO, like there's going to be areas where they're weak at, right? Like great CEOs spike in certain areas and then are low in other areas. And making them spending all of your time and energy and effort getting those low areas higher, that's not a good use of time. Rather, look at the position you're in. You spike in the areas where your CEO is low in. So lean into that, right?
Yeah.
Fill the gap as opposed to spending all this time and energy and effort and emotional, resources complaining that your CEO isn't good at the things that you want her to be good at, if that makes sense.
100%.
I thought it was great advice, and it completely changed the way that I work with people.
Thank you. So, yeah, I'm always fascinated with like what people do outside of their day-to-day job, their day-to-day career, and believe that, we don't live to work, we work to live. And, the more hobbies and interests that we have, the better. And some people shy away from that, especially earlier in their career, because they work, work, work. I got to prove myself. Um, and I know that because my wife Carlene introduced us, and you met at through yoga. So just using that as an example, as a proxy for something outside of work. What got you into that, and how have you leveraged anything that you might have picked up from yoga along the way into doing what you do today?
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely love yoga. And I actually want a book, a future book, to be the lessons of yoga as applied to management, because I think it has deeply influenced how I lead and how I show up at work. And I think what's often hard is that, we might go through a self-discovery journey or a journey of authenticity outside of work. And then how do we actually bring that into work? Mm-hmm. And there's that barrier, right? But it's so important to kind of transpose those things into our day to day. And, I think the big thing with yoga that I learned that's helped me in my work and my career is curiosity, right? Questioning and curiosity, and this idea of patience and acceptance, right? And it's made me much much more patient in the workplace, right? And non-reactive. And I think that's been hugely beneficial to my career, where I can kind of take that step back and say, how am I reacting to this situation? Why am I reacting? What's going on here? Yeah, right? Yeah. What's really behind this? And that's all from yoga.
Yeah, I think if you just look at different ways to take what you're doing, and what your interests are outside of your day-to-day role, there's probably a myriad of ways to kind of bring those learnings or those teachings into doing what you do to make you more effective. So I think that's pretty cool. Rachel, in kind of closing out here, what advice would you have for, let's say, an individual contributor like a sales rep or a manager who feels they're not growing under the leadership of their manager, but they like the company, they like what they do, they don't feel like they're getting something from their specific manager? And I know you talked about the importance of owning your development. So what advice would you have there?
This is also a mistake I made early in my career, is that I was passive about my development and assumed that my manager owned my development, and my manager was the one responsible for helping me to grow. And of course, it is a huge part of your manager's role, but then that means, to your point, it's manager dependent. And unfortunately, what research shows is that there's more bad managers out there than there are good managers. And so the advice is own your own development, which that means a couple different things. First, it means kind of identifying where and how you can grow and what you can do. And then second, it means potentially coaching and guiding your manager to help them help you, right? Be directive with them about what you need from them. And that's going to make their job easier, right? Because it takes some of the cognitive load off. And it will help you. So I would just say, lean into owning your development and figuring out what you want and need, and articulating that to your manager.
Well, can you have a quick example of what that could sound like? What a topic could be, or because I know that there's people out there that say, how do I go to my manager and tell them what I need to, be coached on? Right. It's hard.
Yeah. So, for example, maybe you're a, you do, a lot of maybe prospecting or building databases of potential prospects, but you don't actually get to do sales calls, right? Mm-hmm. You're a junior person and you love to have experience working with clients, right? But you know that that's not a possibility because of the structure of your company. And so what you can do is you can say to your manager, hey, I want to build these skills. What are ways I could build these skills outside of actually having sales calls? And maybe once a week you pitch to your manager, right? And you kind of practice the skill of client facing work, but you're not actually doing it with a client, right? So we often think about skills and capabilities as context driven, right? Mm-hmm. Like to get client I want to do more client facing work, but there's actually a lot of things behind that you can build before you ever face a client, right? And thinking about, well, what are the skills and capabilities required for being great at client facing work? And then how do I build those before I ever meet a client? Similarly, someone might say, hey, like I really, on my development plan, I really want to be a manager. I want to be a people leader. And then your manager says, yeah, but there's no space.
Mhm.
It's like, okay, well, what are the skills or capabilities you can start building and practicing now that a great manager has or needs? And you can build those without managing anyone.
And then when there is space and it's between that person who asked for help and kind of built, took a couple of steps up the ladder and went out of your way to practice, when it's a choice between you and someone else, perhaps you get the nod because you went the extra mile. Awesome. Well, I think that's a really good place to leave it. We learned so much. I learned so much today. We talked about using feedback as a motivator. The fact that an obligation to give feedback is probably not even a strong enough word. We talked about the different archetypes of achiever versus affiliation. We talked about the importance of owning your own development, and feedback is underwear. So we covered a lot of ground. Um, Rachel, I really appreciate you spending time with us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to be here.
Awesome. And if you're tuning in and you've made it this far, firstly, thanks for listening. Secondly, it would mean a lot if you could leave a rating wherever you consume the podcast, Apple, Spotify, wherever it might be. YouTube, where you can see the full length video. Leave a comment. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you'd like to see more of. We want to bring the best content to you. So again, Rachel Pacheco, thanks so much for investing time with us today. And with that, it's been a pleasure to host this conversation on behalf of Coach2Scale. And until next time, remember, coach them if you want to keep them. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Coach2Scale, How Modern Leaders Build Coaching Cultures. For show notes and other episodes, visit us at coachem.io. That's COACHEM.io. And follow us on Twitter at CoachemNow. See you all next week. Thanks for joining. And remember, coach them if you want to keep them.